With me now is the CEO of the JSE Limited, Valdene Reddy. Val, good to have you with me. I know you have just raced out of an AGM today, the first under your leadership. Perhaps we start there. Give me a sense of how everything went.
Hi, Bronwyn. Yes, one that I would describe as a very tidy AGM and echoed by some of the shareholders who had participated today. And I think that came from, on the backdrop of having a very strong set of results that we delivered for our 2025 year. And then lots of engagement that has been ongoing between key stakeholders in preparation to the AGM so that we showed up well prepared and responding to the pertinent questions. It also, as you mentioned, new CEO of the JSE, a big focus for our relevant stakeholders has been the transition and the change in the leadership and what that will yield for the group, which looks quite optimistic in a forward-looking strategy as we embark on a new chapter on the tailwinds of strong markets from 2025, a solid set of results, and then clarity in strategic priority and discipline in our execution going forward. So it set the backdrop for a very tidy AGM, one that was, very neatly delivered and handled by our board, and hopefully to build on that as we progress throughout the year.
You've stepped into one of the most significant leadership positions in South African finance. What has most surprised you, Val, about the CEO role in these first couple of weeks?
Yes, it certainly has been a good challenge. What surprised me the most, I think, is the altitude of the role. I always joke and say over my 20-odd years in markets, I've been a hard worker, productive, really curious. But as a CEO, you carry the whole system. And I think, really digesting that is the breadth of what was surprising, I think, is the altitude. You carry the system of markets, regulation, technology, confidence, people, reputation, all at once. So the CEO role is ultimately a stewardship role, but you're holding an institution that matters far beyond yourself. And you really have to carry that gravitas.
And of all of those elements that you've just unpacked for me, which is harder than you expected? The decisions, the pace, or the weight of the institution, the JSE Limited itself?
I think digesting and absorbing the weight of the institution probably is the biggest one to swallow and to digest. The JSE is deeply woven into the South African economy, and you far comprehend that the decisions here ripple into pensions, savings, capital flows, business confidence. So you ultimately feel that responsibility. The pressure is definitely not something to fear. And in markets, pressure is normal. So the key is staying calm. But I think the weight of the institution really drives that importance home.
This is a little bit of a left field question, but when you introduced yourself to somebody outside of the markets realm, how do you explain what the JSE is beyond a stock exchange? Maybe even bringing your mother into the picture here. Well, when you first told her about your position at the JSE.
Yeah, probably pre my CEO role, I used to also try simplify it, and I used to say it's where we connect capital. But now stepping into a leadership role for the JSE, I think I'd elevate that a little bit more to say the JSE is where trust meets capital. Markets run on confidence, and our job is to protect and grow that confidence every day. Yes, we're a stock exchange, but we're actually fundamentally a national economic infrastructure. We help raise capital, we help investors allocate savings, and markets that really have price discovery. So I would think, saying that it's where trust meets capital is probably the easiest way to capture what we do, but also the essence and the importance of protecting and giving investors confidence.
You've had a long career at the JSE, if I'm correct, since 2015, and a couple of moves, head of equity and equity derivatives, and then director of capital markets, now into the CEO position, as we've said. What do you believe was the internal move that was the real make or break step for you in this entire journey?
Yeah, I think, I've been in markets over 21 years, starting on a trading floor. And since 2015, like you say, it was my time at the JSE in the roles that you highlighted. I think the biggest make or break for me was moving from a specialist role, which was my head of equities role, into the director of capital markets role. And that was a broader capital markets leadership role. I think for me, the biggest internal move or shift for me was that in my early chapters, I focused a lot of technical expertise, firmly believing that's what got you credibility and a seat around the table. But when I shifted to my director capital markets role, it was more about enterprise leadership that required different muscle, balancing commercial outcomes, regulation, stakeholders, technology, and people all simultaneously. So that transition really forced me to stop thinking like a technical expert or industry steward, but thinking more about a builder of institutions.
What was the first time in your career that you thought, I can do this, I can lead from the top?
So, if someone asked me, I think I was very clear even early on of where I started my career, and I've always been in markets and loved what I've done. And when I started, even as graduate roles or even in coming to the JSE, I've always aspired to go to stretch myself to lead at the top, not because I thought I was ready at that time, but I wanted to make sure I was putting my hand up for opportunities, but also getting myself ready. So I wouldn't say it's one dramatic moment, but what you learn through that mindset is that it actually comes as repetition under pressure. You go through different situations, experiences, market volatility, difficult negotiations, crises, strategic decisions. And eventually you realize people are already looking to you for decision before you formally arrived at that role. And that's usually the signal that you're ready to lead at the top.
Here's an interesting one. I've often spoken about mentors, and I've had many mentors in my life, but this term sponsors is really when somebody puts their reputation on the line, their reputation on the line for you. Have you had real sponsors in your career?
Yes. And, I want to say people often ask me how I survived as a female in the industry because it was a proper trading industry, but also, how I progressed. And I can honestly attribute that to the sponsors. I've been blessed and privileged to have key sponsors, including my first boss in markets, who remains actually, quite a good, I would say, sponsor, but mentor, confidant, friend. And so I've been blessed to have key and critical sponsors all the way through my journey. I think they're reciprocal elements. You talk about mentorship, and that's often, an investment from a senior person into you. But sponsorship is a reciprocal investment because equally as someone sponsors you, they put their own credibility on the line. And I have to say, probably in my most meaningful chapter, I've had the best sponsor as well in my last boss, which is Leila Fourie, who is the outgoing CEO of the JSE. I've worked under Leila's leadership for the last 6 years as a direct report to her. And in the last couple of months, as she made her own plans to transition and move on to her own chapter in life, she has been really good in supporting me, not just, as a namesake, but in the exposures. She's given me the opportunity, the empowerment, and parallel skills development as we've done that. So even in our own transition, I want to actually, really call out Leila Fourie in how she sponsored me in this chapter.
So the JSE is both a market operator and a frontline regulator. Those two imperatives can collide. And when they do, which is growth versus market integrity, which principle wins?
Integrity every time. So a market can recover from slower growth. It cannot recover from lost trust. And I think in the South African ecosystem, we've had many examples where trust was lost. And the JSE is really credible. In fact, credibility is our most valued asset. So growth built on compromised integrity is ultimately fragile growth. And you always say liquidity follows trust. So I'd have to say integrity every time. Even though we're chasing growth and we're setting ambitions for growth, integrity will far surpass that.
This is a question that I've asked a number of executives who sat in the hotspot that you are in right now. That is how you go about decision making. Do you make decisions fast and then you adjust, or do you build consensus and then move only once you've got that consensus?
So I move fast, I think fast, I speak fast. So I think I naturally make decisions fast. And in fact, one of my compliments today was I was slower in my delivery pace in my AGM, first AGM. So that shows you a recalibration event. But yeah, so I move fast on principle and slower on complexity. So I'm pretty comfortable making difficult decisions. but I want to have strong challenge before we actually get to that decision. So I don't believe consensus means everybody agrees, but I strongly believe that it means people were heard rigorously before that decision is set. And I think that's what helps you move on pace with a decision. And that's why I say I move fast on principle and slow on the complexity. And once a decision is made, though, clarity matters. So markets actually punish hesitation. So you also have to back your conviction. So that's why I think robust interrogation before the decision is made is the imperative to get to faster decision making.
So Val, we've had some very honest conversations with the leadership contingent in South Africa here on Executive Exchange, and nothing goes in a straight line. So there are ups and downs. And Stephen Saad was incredibly open in some of the missteps that he had made in a leadership journey and what he had learned from that. So I'm going to take you there and say, what's a leadership mistake that you've made on the way up that you still clearly remember because it changed the way that you lead today?
Yeah, and I think, thankfully through age and through experience, you get maturity. But earlier in my career, and maybe naively so, I assumed that capability alone would carry teams through difficult periods. And it actually doesn't. And as I said, as we've gone through cycles, maturity, different experience, we've had global pandemics of epic proportions over the last 5 years, and capability alone won't carry a team. And people also need context, inclusion, and belief. So I learned that highly driven leaders sometimes under-communicate because the destination feels obvious to them. And if people don't understand why execution matters, that's a mistake you can make. And as I mentioned, a large part of my background, my curiosity, my skill set came from technical competence and capability, and then assuming that would be enough to carry teams' vision and communication is actually an Achilles heel. So in stepping into this role, I challenged myself, and I'm talking as recently as the last 3 to 4 months, what would be one of my strongest shifts that I would have to make? And the two things actually resonate to what would have been earlier leadership mistakes I made. One is to say, as much as I'm technically curious and I love being invested in the detail, that's actually not what will take us through of what's needed in a strategic mindset shift. So almost making that shift is a conscious decision for me. And second was the latter point I made is assuming teams would just, have the conviction and the understanding. So my second growth area for myself is more effective communication. How do I work with all levels of stakeholders to get clearer in the vision, in the why, in the belief, in the context, so that we can actually strengthen our execution? Because if people don't understand the why, you weaken the execution. And that's a high imperative of me to take as an early challenge and an early leadership mistake to refine that in this chapter.
What's the hardest conversation that you've had to have as a leader? Did you potentially delay it? And what did it cost you to delay it?
Yeah, this is also personal in nature, but, giving difficult feedback to someone that's highly talented but misaligned culturally or behaviorally is probably one of the highest opportunity costs to delay. Many leaders delay those conversations because, you think capability or expertise can mask deeper issues for a while, but culture debt actually accumulates quietly. So in avoiding those difficult conversations, I learned that it doesn't remove the cost. It actually could increase the cost. And if you compromise like culture or misalignment in behavior, you could compromise a whole lot more than just the outcome. So it's one of the hardest conversations, I think, that is delayed.
To reach this level, Val, there are sacrifices that people don't see. Can you share with us what you've had to give up, postpone to get to the corner office at the JSE?
Yes, I think it becomes acutely more important as pressures and demands get higher, and the world is busy and the world is noisy. So I think, the biggest thing you sacrifice to get here is time. And in fact, if you speak to any experienced CEO or much more established board member who's walked a journey, they'll tell you time is your highest commodity or your most precious asset. So senior leadership.
Well, there's a finite amount of time, right?
Exactly. So that is really it is a tangible sacrifice, and even as I've come into this chapter, I've had to consciously make where my time is spent, because it does come at a sacrifice. So senior leadership, it demands the intensity. I certainly can feel it, sense it. And there's periods where balance is more aspirational than reality. Now, I love and I do resonate with this moderation factor. Is we talk about work-life balance, but there's a beautiful concept that it's all life. And so it's really important to know, how do you prioritize, because time is the sacrifice here. So, success is unsustainable if every part of your identity becomes tied to the role. So allocating your time, I think, is really important if there's high demands.
And what do you protect fiercely now?
Oh,
something that you won't actually give up.
Yes, so clarity of mind, I think it's very important. I need a lot of percolation time to digest things, because you're not making isolated decisions or directions. And then the quality of the relationships. We talk about energy and what you invest in yourself, and the quality of the relationships around you is what I protect. Everybody wants a piece of you, whether it's personal, professional, new connections. So if you don't protect your thinking time and then the people closest to you, you eventually operate reactively rather than strategically, both on personal and professional level. So I protect clarity of mind and quality of relationships the most at the moment.
I asked Simon Beloy, the CEO of Sasol, what he does to ensure that he can cope with the pressure of his day job in his spare time. In other words, what is that you use to relax? I know Simon does a lot of running, for instance. Can you share something along those lines?
Yes, for me, it's perspective. I think that's my first moderator factor of what I do to keep grounded in the role. And then with that, it's then prioritizing what matters the most, that actually energize and reinvest into me. So family, close relationships, quiet time is a must for me. I'm a huge extrovert, and I love drawing energy from others. But as you get busier and more strategic in your thinking, you need quiet time. And I exercise quite a bit, invest in myself. So those things matter to say that the identity is bigger than the position. And because I have different personas, whether I'm a mother, a daughter, CEO of the JSE, it's important that I actually make the right investment into those different chapters, in terms of what that needs. So some things are non-negotiable. My time for myself and my exercise and my eating routines are quite sacrilegious. And then spending time with my family, close relationships, and with people that energize me is really important.
So let's look to a 2-year element for the JSE. What parameters should we focus on in that 2-year period to say this has been a success under Valdene Reddy? And if that is too short a time frame, you want to push it out and say, listen, it's 5 years, you take the line in the sand in terms of what you think we can get to.
So at the moment, we're setting our Forge 2031 strategy. And as that takes shape, later on this year and endorsed by the board, will come to market. But it's quite good that you said that, because even within that, we are looking at what meaningful change we can bring in the next 2 to 3 years, and then what meaningful change we can bring from now to the next 5 years. So it's a build on strategy. But if you had to ask me whether it's 2 or 3 years, what would the JSE be stronger as? We would want to see that the JSE is much more competitive. The environment is becoming a lot more diverse, innovative, disruptive. So we want to lead on the front foot of saying we are absolutely competitive, that we are trusted, and that we are relevant to grow in South Africa and beyond. So our ambition is for the JSE to be viewed not just as a market operator. We will protect that with deep quality and with sustained investment. But we also want to invest in future chapters of growth. And if we look at where we came from just 2 years ago, the opportunity set is far bigger. So we want to make sure we are seen as a strategic enabler of economic growth. As we build that strategy, we'll put out more tangibles. But if I had to summarize that, we want to show that South Africa has deeper pools of capital, that there's a much stronger market participation, improved issue activity, and we're already seeing the tailwinds of that manifest. And then the JSE, if the old, will protect it, but we also want the JSE to be seen as relevant, fresh, leading in modernization and innovation to really establish the stronghold of South Africa even further, with the JSE leading a large part of that. So our future belongs to markets, and we want to create a resilient exchange of the future.
So Val, I think it's great for our audience to get to know you better. Thank you for taking the time to share your strategic imperative, some personal information, and we look forward to coloring your journey. We've been speaking to Valdene Reddy, CEO of JSE.